He's the controversial come-from-behind candidate that even Donald Trump said this about.
I'd even take Biden over Jr. because our country would last about a year or two longer than it would with Jr. It would collapse almost immediately.
And he's asking for your vote. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s meteoric rise as an independent candidate for president is as shocking as it is inevitable, with the two major parties anointing octogenarians with attitude problems for their respective tickets, both of which are vastly unpopular with wide swaths of the electorate. A genuine third-party option may, for the first time in my life, be a viable one. And there's real evidence that America wants something different. Since 2004, when there were roughly the same number of Republicans, Democrats, and independents in the United States, Republicans and Democrats have nosedived into equally bad numbers, representing around 27% of the electorate each. Independents without party affiliation represent 43% now. 43%. And the number is still rising as both parties rush to the extreme edges to appeal to their ever more radical voters. This leaves a vast gulf in the middle that feels nobody is representing their values. Unfortunately, independents also feel that other independents likely don't represent their values either, with a broad spectrum from moderate left to moderate right, and the inevitable outlier that just thinks the radicals aren't radical enough. But if someone could unite the independents, the result would be a massive movement that dwarfs both major parties. Enter Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He ticks off both sides. Donald Trump declared that if he had to choose, he would take Biden over Kennedy. Kennedy's own family has vociferously endorsed Joe Biden over RFK Jr.'s bid.
My name is Carrie Kennedy, and I am the seventh child of Robert and Ethel Kennedy. We want to make crystal clear our feeling that the best way forward for America is to re-elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to 4 more years.
And more than anything else, he represents a direct challenge to the institutional power that Republicans and Democrats have enjoyed for generations. So who is this man who unites both sides against him? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was born to Robert F. Kennedy and Ethel Skakel in 1954. He is the nephew of President John F. Kennedy and Senator Ted Kennedy. He was raised in wealth, running in rarefied circles of power that few will ever know. His father, Robert Kennedy, was assassinated during his own presidential run, while Jr. was only 14 years old. This began a pretty dark period of his life: drugs, legal issues, and more. Still, he moved forward with his life, educated at Harvard and graduating in 1976 with a bachelor's degree in American history and literature. He would later receive a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Virginia School of Law in 1982, with the following Masters of Laws from Pace in 1987. A 1984 conviction resulted in Kennedy entering a drug treatment center, with the condition of his probation being volunteer work with the Natural Resources Defense Council. He volunteered for the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, later renamed Riverkeeper, eventually becoming senior attorney. He aggressively litigated environmental enforcement lawsuits on the East Coast estuaries on behalf of Riverkeeper for some years, with his work setting long-term environmental legal standards. Decades of environmental litigation followed, with Kennedy eventually founding the law firm Kennedy and Madonna, LLP, alongside environmental lawyer Kevin Madonna. The firm represented private plaintiffs against polluters. Yes, this means he was representing the little guy against big corporate for much of his adult life. He would become counsel to the law firm Morgan & Morgan, where he would eventually sue Monsanto due to a toxic exposure to Roundup, which may have caused instances of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. A follow-up lawsuit was brought as a class action due to the lack of warning from the company about the dangers. There is simply just too much in this man's history to do it justice in a brief piece like this. He worked on behalf of minority and poor communities, indigenous communities, and international groups. He has criticized everyone for any environmental damage, including the U.S. military. He has advocated for renewable energy, transitioning from fossil fuels, opposing nuclear power and coal. He has called for greater investigation and research in vaccines, asking for greater testing. His views have been broadly panned as anti-vaccine, and he has promoted some fringe theories on the topic over the years. and so much more that could be listed. However, we're most concerned with how the man who is running for president is today. It's clear that he has a passion for the environment and that he watches out for the less fortunate. It's also clear that he has strong opinions on many topics. So let's take a look at his public positions and a couple of controversies that have cropped up in this very election cycle, where everyone has a motivation to take the other guy down. We'll start with his website, where he lists out several parts of his core policies. He opposes large corporations and their ties to the government, especially in regards to pollution and extraction. However, he also points out a belief that Big Ag controls the Department of Agriculture. He says this makes our food unhealthy. He also believes that Wall Street's control of the Federal Reserve, Treasury, and SEC has resulted in the decimation of the middle class. He calls for honest, competent leadership throughout the federal government, rooting out corruption and corporate-friendly agency leaders, and replacing them with reformers dedicated to the national interest. He also calls for a 5-year ban on former officials being able to lobby their former agency. He also calls for transparency so that the public can have faith in their government. RFKJr calls for raising the minimum wage to $15 per hour, greater union organization, and expanded free childcare. This falls under policies that he believes will restore the middle class. He calls for government-backed 3% home mortgages with tax-free bonds. He wants to cut energy prices by restricting natural gas exports. For the small business, he calls for regulatory scrutiny to fall on larger corporations instead of the small business. He does call for securing the border and bringing illegal immigration to a halt, saying this would stop illegal immigrants from undercutting wages. He also calls for renegotiated trade deals so that low-wage countries don't compete with American workers. RFKJr calls for spending less on the military and using those funds for infrastructure, healthcare, and higher education. He also calls for less military adventures and regime change wars, which is what he calls Ukraine. He calls for an end to the U.S. treating citizens as suspects and to stop manipulating the public with propaganda and targeted leaks. He also calls for the end of weaponizing the law against political opponents. He also calls for not allowing our public officials to be above the rule of law, which is pretty unique among the current crop of presidential prospects. Then there's a few more controversial topics for American conservatives. During a recent podcast visit, RFKJr revealed that he does not believe in government restrictions on abortion, calling for it to be left to the decision of the mother even up to the end of the pregnancy at the 9th month. He has since retracted this position, stating that it was clarified that there are late-term abortions that take place for non-medical reasons. He has since called for government restrictions on abortion once the child has reached a stage of development where it be viable outside the womb. His real plan to reduce the number of abortions is his More Choices, More Life program, which calls for a massive subsidized daycare initiative. This would redirect foreign aid funds, and his website does specifically mention those funds that were sent to Ukraine to subsidizing community and home-based daycares, with 100% coverage for those under 5 years old beneath the poverty line. The idea is that with more support for mother and child after birth, there would be less need for abortion. However, you can tell how much RFKJr has rattled the establishment when headlines like these are being run by the New York Times. This turned out to be a common parasite contracted while doing environmental work in far-flung parts of the globe, and he has been very humorous about this very topic.
Anyway, I didn't really come prepared to tell the jokes. My brainworm wrote some jokes for me. He's very funny. He's got a lot of information. This is where I get most of my facts. A lot of his stuff is conspiracy theories. You have to filter that out. But he's funny. Oh.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. may scare the Dems and the Republicans, but should he also scare you? It depends, well, a lot on your politics. That's, obvious. Captain Obvious over here. Eliminating government corruption and getting corporate interests out of the halls of power should interest every conservative and should interest every liberal as well. However, some may find his evolving stance on abortion troubling, but understanding it requires understanding his fundamental principles. And according to what I'm seeing, these are some of RFK Jr.'s principles. Government has no role in the medical decisions of a family. Government, however, should be caring for the needs of the individual. This includes stopping corporate pollution and environmental damage, regulating what companies are allowed to produce and market, and more. From analyzing his positions, I conclude he comes to an individual first perspective and a strongly anti-corporate bias. I find the lack of references to the U.S. Constitution beyond the Bill of Rights to be concerning. In some cases, he appears to be a big government guy. In others, he is calling for restricting the government. From my perspective, this leaves us with another mixed bag. The fact that he is constantly analyzing his positions and accepting new information is pretty heartening. But one can also conclude that he has a questionable foundation when it comes to these core principles. So what do I think of RFK Jr. himself? Obviously, we've got some core issues for conservatives. There's core issues for liberals. There's core issues for pretty much everybody. And this leaves you with pretty much a, is he worth it? And one of the things that my own mother has drilled into me is a politician should be honest, good, and wise. That doesn't mean he has to agree with you on everything. But when I run RFK Jr. through honest, good, and wise, I do believe he's a relatively honest man. The good and the wise, though, are yet to be seen. We'll just have to keep an eye on how things go and see what we see as the election goes forward. Let me know what you think of RFK Jr. in the comments below. In particular, I want to know if you have additional information that might give a better perspective on what he believes, how he feels, and the government he would run. I have a list of questions. I would love it if I could ask him directly, or if they would provide a spokesperson that I could talk to with that list of questions. In fact, I've even written them out so there'd be no surprises. But we'll have to see if they respond to my emails or anywhere else. And on that, thank you very much for joining me today. You have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next video.